The story of Canada's province of British Columbia begins essentially in the late 1700s. Sadly, it is largely a story of commerce and greed-based exploration and expansion. Russian, Spanish, British, and American expeditions traded with indigenous peoples on the Pacific coast from the 1770s on. In 1808, Simon Fraser found a water route from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean that would serve the interests of the Northwest Company. His name was given to the river that functioned as a virtual highway for transportation in earliest years. The major player, however, would be the Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, established in 1670, whose headquarters were in England. The HBC set up its presence on the west coast of North America in 1821. The first location, Fort Vancouver, is in present-day Washington State, USA. 3 years later, HBC's governor, George Simpson, sent James McMillan to find a site for a fort north of the 49th parallel where influence of American competition would not reach. A site was found, and in 1827, Fort Langley was established on the Fraser River. The following year marked the arrival of James Yale, a skilled businessman whose expertise could make Fort Langley profitable. The main commodity for export was beaver pelts. These were used for fancy hats for men in Britain and around the world in the British Empire. Salmon was also exported from Fort Langley, primarily to Hawaii. Initially, relations with local indigenous people, those who speak Stolo Halkomelem, were crucial as the foundation of the business endeavor's success. An important Stolo village was right across the water from Fort Langley. These fur and salmon exports depended on the indigenous people's expertise, productivity, and cooperation for their success. Stolo is the indigenous name for Fraser River. Intermarriage was strategic and even sought out by leading officials for the company's men. The fort was much like a hermitage, where only insiders could dwell. Surrounded by a palisade wall, it had extra fortifications at the corners. Trade was done through a relatively small window by the principal gateway. Barrels were made here. There was naturally a blacksmith shop, and also storage. A large structure at one end served as the headquarters of operations. The fort's commercial operations flourished for 3 decades. In 1858, everything changed. News of individuals striking gold in the region brought waves of mostly American newcomers. The thousands of prospectors vastly outnumbered the British men operating out of Fort Langley. It was, in particular, the threat of the loss of this hard-won wing of HBC trade territory that led to drastic measures. At first, the fort found the visitors to be a lucrative explosion of clients making enormous daily sales, but the virtual deluge of immigrants had the British Empire's man on the scene, James Douglas, afraid. He sent an urgent note to Britain to send naval forces. He got what he asked for. The gold seekers were not a well-disciplined bunch. Indigenous people saw and heard of many injustices along the Fraser River, ranging from vandalism and theft to even sexual violence and murder. Then tragedy struck. A number of massacres led to full-fledged war between the quasi-military forces of gold seekers and warriors of indigenous communities. What did James Douglas do? Nothing. Instead, it fell to an American nicknamed Captain Snyder to broker for peace. Acting in good faith with Stolo chief Lequitem, he traveled up the river into the dangerous region. The pair of American and indigenous leaders managed to dissuade enraged, embittered cohorts of Aboriginal and European background men from slaughtering one another. What was Douglas's response? He was appalled that, as he saw it, Aboriginal peoples and Americans were making treaties on so-called British lands. You see, the British were afraid that Americans would expand their influence north of the 49th parallel, a boundary that had only been firmly established 2 years earlier. Then, in a frantic exertion of sheer force, with the backing of the British monarch, Douglas unilaterally declared the region to be a colony of the British Empire. This unfortunate move by Douglas is still celebrated at national Canadian sites as though a just move, the American threat to British business interests is still officially cited as though a legitimate reason for this outright example of colonialism. But the fallout of all this was to add tragedy upon tragedy. Do you think that relations between the new colony's leaders and local indigenous peoples were sweetened by all this? Not at all. In fact, Fort Langley was abandoned as the leading site in the region for the British, and a capital was founded farther downstream on the Fraser River called New Westminster. Douglas himself moved there. An era was over. Chief Trader James Yale retired. This physical relocation was emblematic of the cooling of relations between indigenous peoples in the British region. Some men abandoned the Aboriginal women they had sought to build a life with and moved to the new capital. Douglas's own father-in-law abandoned the indigenous woman Suzanne or Mayonipi, whom he had been with for 30 years in order to cohabit with a white woman and allegedly begin a new family. Indigenous people went from being valued for the fur trade to now being considered in progress's way. During its 30 years of prominence, not surprisingly, Fort Langley did not have a church or services, nor, from what I can gather, a regular Christian minister. Churches would not appear in the area of Fort Langley until sometime after the region was declared a British colony. In this way, it is unlike the colonial cities of Victoria, New Westminster, and even Vancouver, which in each case early on had a notable Christian presence. No, the DNA of both the fort and the colony was in the other foundation of the British Empire, namely the values inherent in the ancient empires of Alexander the so-called Great and of the Romans. The town that eventually grew up around Fort Langley was quaint, and it has remained that way till this day. The largest structure, the community hall, is notable for its Greco-Roman architecture. And that's the story of how the colony of British Columbia began. It is by no means an isolated incident of colonial aspirations with deep roots in ancient Greek and Romans and their precedent in taking advantage of indigenous peoples. The rift between those early British settlers and the indigenous peoples is still strongly felt today.